Nick Leeson, good morning. We are back with another episode of the Money Clinic. We agreed mutually to take a break last week. It was appropriate to allow you to grieve. Obviously, it was very sad that England lost the way they did. I predicted an Italian win on penalties. Have you any comment to make on the Euros? Are you happy with it, or would you just like to move on to the real Money Clinic discussion?
I think, like the financial markets, Conor, I've become very forward-looking. So what's happened in the past is very much now history. It's forgotten about, and I'm looking forward to the World Cup. I'm looking forward to the Premier League and Man City winning another title.
Excellent response. So we haven't spoken in a couple of weeks.
No.
A couple of things we're going to touch on in the next 8 or 9 minutes, but in terms of the markets have been quiet. Has there been any update worth discussing? And then I think you want to have a chat briefly about Bitcoin.
Yeah, well, look, I mean, there's a few things, I suppose. We've started earnings season, and the earnings to date have been quite good. You know, they've been in most cases they've exceeded expectations. So the banks are always the first ones to report, and we have some of the technology companies reporting at the moment, but they've all been good. Unfortunately, on Monday there was a big sell-off in the market. It was the worst day of 2021 for the Dow, so it was down just about 4% on the day. I think that's the worst sell-off since October of last year. So, and that was all COVID, Delta variant related, and a bit of emotional trading around the fear that we might see some big sell-offs on the back of COVID yet again. It didn't materialize. All of those losses are now back. So we're fairly flat. And then Bitcoin as well. The reason why I wanted to have a quick look at Bitcoin today, and I'll just share the screens there, is, you know, when we started talking about this 5 or 6 months ago, we're now back to exactly the same level. We're currently trading around the 31,000, 32,000 mark. We've had that massive roller coaster ride up to 60, 63, 64,000, and we're back down at 31. So we've lost 50% of its value since the high. And the thing of interest for me, in line with this announcement that there's going to be a digital currency or potentially a digital currency in Europe as well, is that all of the volatility or a lot of the volatility has been sucked out of Bitcoin, and we're trading in quite a narrow range now, or a narrow range for Bitcoin anyway. So it's just interesting the journey that Bitcoin has been on as we've been talking about it for the last 6 months or so as well.
We've talked about this before, but in your opinion, right, which I'm interested in, how influential are people like Musk, and the most recent, like Jack Dorsey, who owns Twitter, is a huge advocate of Bitcoin, and there was musings this morning that Twitter are considering taking payments for advertising revenue in Bitcoin. Those kinds of measures and that kind of discussion, how influential is that on the pricing then of Bitcoin?
Is they're very influential in two forms. Firstly, that they have a huge social media presence, which they can use to influence the price of things, and I think we've seen that over the last 6 months as well. And then secondly, obviously they have huge private and business wealth that I think to a certain extent controls a lot of the Bitcoin market. So, you know, we spoke in recent weeks about financial markets, and there being a certain amount of speculators, and there being a certain amount of investors, and banks being one of the largest parts of that. I think when you look at Bitcoin, it's very heavily influenced by speculators. So Dorsey and Elon Musk are a huge part of that, and they control a lot of the market, in my opinion. And it's good that it's settled down over the last few weeks or so.
Yeah, we did. We talked about that, the three different groups of people: the speculators, the traders, and the investors. And what you're basically saying, there's a lot of speculators in that particular market, which is interesting. I want to switch the dial a little bit and ask you about, over the break a couple of weeks ago, it actually was on the David McWilliams podcast, where he broke a story where Bank of Ireland were apparently looking to acquire Davies. Davies are under this big investigation by something that they happened with the Belfast client. And actually the story that McWilliams was sort of talking about was the fact that the Irish government were now selling off their stake in the Bank of Ireland at probably the worst time, because, you know, why not hold on a while and you'll get more money. And then this morning I see in the Financial Times where Morgan Stanley have been instructed to handle the UK government are now offloading their £12 billion stake in NatWest. And I'm just interested in your thoughts. Like, why are governments, do you think, now looking at selling stakes in banks, given the fact that, you know, share prices in banks have went from a low base? They do seem to be on the up. And would it not be more prudent to hold? What do you think's happening in that bank market?
Yeah. I suppose there's a couple of different ways of looking at that. You know, number one, I'm sure that the governments aren't really in the business of speculating, so they're not really going to try and speculate about where the price is going to move from here. I'm sure that they need money as well. You know, we're all sort of working our way through this pandemic, and the governments are going to have to start to and we know that they borrow more over the next period. I think one of the other things that I think is key within this as well, just from in terms of Davies and, you know, why people might court some of these banks, is that there's a big difference between what is an investment bank and what is retail banking. So retail banking is what we all know from a day-to-day basis. You know, they lend money, they give mortgages, and there's a few other things that they get up to. But it's not particularly, you know, it's not an extensive list. The bigger investment banks, so the Morgan Stanleys, the Goldman Sachs of this world, you know, heavily involved in fixed income trading, heavily involved in other forms of earning money as well from a trading output. And if you scratch below the surface of some of the huge numbers that we've seen in terms of the profits that they've generated over the last number of weeks, you know, the core business, the bank lending, the mortgage writing and stuff of that ilk isn't performing that well. So, you know, Bank of Ireland buying Davies, is that because they need to grow another opportunity to earn money? Because we know they're not lending, or they're not lending a great deal. I don't think the money's available, and certainly that income stream for the Irish banks is severely strained.
Yeah, I take your point. It is interesting that NatWest and Bank of Ireland, who wouldn't really be considered investment banks, are trying to figure out ways to make more money. I think that's okay. I mean, they're both, you know, they're private, they're companies. They need to make profit. Yeah. But it is an interesting move by the Bank of Ireland, if that does happen, to acquire Davies. You were going to ask me something about funding.
Yeah. Well, look, I noticed one of your posts on LinkedIn this week where you were giving an update on funding. I think it dovetails into this quite nicely because, you know, the amount of lending that's being done by the banks here in Ireland is at a very low level, and people can't access finance. So let's hear about this update on funding.
Yeah, it was something that I posted yesterday. It was really a funding update, and what I was trying to was give a 15-month overview of what's happened in the funding and the finance space. And what I was sort of saying was anyone who has a facility or had borrowed money, which was coming to an end in the last period of the pandemic, most of these banks have been fairly amenable to rolling the loans over, rolling the facilities for 3, 6, 9, 12 months. There's no real new lending done from mainstream lenders as such. But actually what all of the action and most of the action in the funding lending space is happening and has been happening outside of the mainstream lenders in Ireland as we know them. The alternative lending market is now back after being very quiet throughout the pandemic. They're very aggressive. The growth of the family office market, which is very unsophisticated in Ireland and certainly in Northern Ireland, that has grown substantially in the last 12 months. And then, you know, we've talked about this before, the appetite of the private equity companies are now sort of, the reach is now looking at the island of Ireland, and they're looking at nursing homes, hotels, residential schemes we talked about last week. So I think like there's a wall of money available out there for business owners. It's just interesting, the dynamic is shifting away from more mainstream lenders into other sources of funding. But look, time has beaten us again. That was interesting this week. We covered a lot of ground. I will catch you up again next week then.
Absolutely. Take care.
Cheers, mate.